Adrian Davis, Patrick DeLoach, Trevon Glass, and I'm missing one other. Withers, Dontavius Withers. And we know that on October 26th, when Moretti saw that surveillance, Cortland Henry identified all of them. And in fact told them that he lives at this young man's house I made a mistake. Jacoby Mills was in the car. It was Jacoby Mills, Adrian Davis, Trevon Glass, and Dontavius Withers. Okay? I can't keep the names straight. I'm lucky if I can remember my own name. That's why I haven't written it down. We know that Moretti identified all 8 people that left the studio on October 26th. We also know that Moretti knew where this young man lived, along with all the other 7 people that left the studio. We all know that, according to the state, Cortland Henry lied to the police. And we also know, as the investigation progressed, that Cortland Henry had blood matching the victim on his clothes. And he also had GSR, or gunshot residue, on his clothes. If that were true, and you saw the pictures of the Jeep, all bloody, blood all over the place, and we learned that you could spray and determine if there was blood right here on the carpet, even though you don't see it, why in the heck don't you get a search warrant for the house? Why in the heck don't you? Don't tell us we didn't know where he lived. Don't tell us it was months later, because they go into the car 4 years later and do this. So why don't you do it? Because Detective Melly and the Miramar Police Department, as everyone has said, lacks the experience and the training. We don't have to do a darn thing, folks. We don't have to do a thing. But let's go into the 11 witnesses now. The first one, and they mentioned him, George Bello, the manager, the head guy of the gun and tool mark unit of the entire Broward Sheriff's Office. And he tells you, after we get a great education of guns and projectiles and casings, we have to bring out the fact that can you tell or determine the distance between the shooter and the victim? Can you tell us that with all your experience? And what does he say? I can't do it unless I have the weapon, unless I have the ammunition, because If you believe George Bello, and I suggest you should, then he totally contradicts all the testimony of Sergeant Williams, who comes in here 4 and 5 years later and says, I can tell you where shooter 1 was, and I can tell you who the shooter is. You talk about a conflict in the testimony? It's one or the other. It can't be both. And he tells you, in addition to that, that the environment has to be considered. Now, Williams tells you he goes out to the scene some 4 or 5 years later and has no idea, nor did he even check the terrain, the environment on that particular morning hour. So you got to believe one or the other. You can't believe both of them because they are in direct conflict with each other. But let's go further. The next witness that you should consider is FBI agent Brendan Collins. He is an expert in tracking phones. He is not only an expert in Broward County, but he's an expert, and his team have been specially trained to map phones, not only in this country, but anywhere in the world if he's called upon. They brought him in. And what does he tell you? This expert. I cannot determine precisely the location of a phone. I cannot say 100% the phone is in, and you saw the band, it looks like a banana. He says, I think it's somewhere within this area, but I can't be 100% sure. He's candid with you. And he further tells you that the call detail records are limited. And I can't tell you who had the phone at any particular time. And most importantly, he tells you in making the mapping of the phones, the FBI, the special agents, do not use 2 items that are on the bill. That is the environment section, and he does not map out based upon the longitude and latitude. He goes to the cell towers and where they're bouncing off. And it could vary depending upon the strongest signal or how busy that network is. Well, he contradicts Williams, the one who comes up and tells you the phone is at this location here, this location here, this location here, at these particular times. It's one or the other, folks. I suggest to you there's another conflict in the testimony. The next witness I think you need to pay particular attention to and really get a flavor of what this case is all about is Felicia Holmes. Felicia Holmes tells you that the Miramar detectives, Moretti and his group, threatened her, bullied her daughter, told potential witnesses they were going to prison, told witnesses that they may never see their children again, told a witness that he was going to be deported even though he's been in this country since 5 years old. He was going to be deported to Haiti where they won't feed you. The place is, with all due respect, and excuse my language, but it was his language that he used, shit. This is the great detective. This is why this kid's sitting here. They have intimidated and threatened everybody. So I ask you, I beg you, to consider Felicia Holmes, because that tells you what's going on. When Moretti got that surveillance tape and realized this young man, this little kid, excuse me for calling him a kid, he was 19 at the time, was a rap star, making more money than he'll ever see in his entire career at 19. He got tunnel vision. And he wanted to nail this kid. And what better way to move up the ranks, get some publicity, is to arrest the star. If they arrest Howard or myself, they go, who the hell is Addleston? Who the hell is Howard? That's the bottom line. So he just focused in, and everything was directed to get this kid. That's why he ignored everything. And that's why he intimidated and threatened anybody that said something different. So I ask you to pay attention to Felicia Holmes, because you do get an idea of what this investigation is. The fourth witness was a Kurt Rhodes, the DNA expert. Now, why is he important? Because while we were picking a jury in April and we were off in May, this prosecutor asked him to go back to the car and check some DNA. Now, why would you do that? The case, according to Moretti, is closed as soon as this young man is arrested. Why do you go back 5 years and ask an expert, a DNA expert, to do some more testing? This kid walked into the Broward, voluntarily surrendered. And 5 years later, they have the audacity to say, do a little more testing. Why? Because now we're in trial. And they realize there's problems with the case. Why else would you do it? Three years after this young man surrenders, they bring in Danny Polo. I call him the masked man. He came in here for a few hours, if you recall, got on this witness stand and wore a ski mask over his entire face where you could only see his eyes. They came in here. He got involved in 2022 at the request, again, of the state, the prosecutor. What was the purpose of that? The great gang expert? They wanted to link him to some gang. You know, in the rap culture, whether you want to accept it or not, gangs are attracted to it. If you want to be successful in rap music, you are going to pick up some of the nuances of various gangs. Snoop Dogg, to this day, it was. Oh, all right.
No problem. Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, this is argument. All right, just proceed, counsel. Objection is overruled.
Snoop Dogg, to this day, does hand signs of a gang. And he does that because he realizes it promotes his music. That's the bottom line. And because he wants to promote his music, make money, he's all of a sudden this big gang guy. And they wait till 2022 to bring him in. I thought the case was closed, according to Melly. And they show you some text messages from, I think it was Gino Herc and Wando, who fought with Anthony Williams previously. Now, certainly, if the investigation is being fair and you want to find who was involved in this case, you would relay that information to the lead detective of people of interest or suspects. And what do we find out? Moretti has no idea who Gino is, no idea who Herc is, and doesn't know about Wando. This is the great investigation. But he also refers to some text messages where those individuals that are in fact associated with the gang text him and he's not responding. And to the point of not responding, they say they're going to put you on the plate. Now that's not for dinner. That's not for breakfast. We learned what that means. If you don't start responding to us, we're going to have you killed. What the heck's going on? Why wouldn't you investigate this? They want you to believe that there's no evidence of that. How do they know there's no evidence if they don't investigate? They don't search. They don't look. You got all these phones. Get Gino and Herc. You have their text messages. Go get their phones. Track them and see. We don't have to do a thing, folks. The presumption of innocence stays with us during the entire trial until and if they can prove beyond every reasonable doubt that this young man did anything wrong. Moretti didn't want to look at that. Why? Because God forbid they find some evidence. His arrest of a star is down the tubes. That's the bottom line. I want you to pay particular attention to Dr. McDougall and Dr. Saunders. Because those two doctors, one being the chief medical examiner of Broward County, the other one, an associate medical examiner, I think now employed in West Palm Beach, say to you that the first shot to Williams and Thomas were fatal, deadly. Why is that important? Because according to Sergeant Williams, Thomas's injury to his hand came first. It was a defensive wound. We know that couldn't happen based upon the medical testimony. So you either have to disregard the medical examiner and accept what Williams' testimony is, or I suggest, now that you have four experts contradicting Williams' testimony, and that is Bello, Special Agent, FBI Agent Collins, and two medical examiners, conflict with Williams' testimony, that you should take Williams' testimony and ignore it, toss it out. You can't have it both ways. It just doesn't work. And then we get to really their star witness, two star witnesses. Sergeant Williams. And I think I've talked a bit about him. And I think the most amazing part of his testimony is that he does not get involved in this case until 3 years after the incident. Again, at the request of the state. Again, because they realize they have problems. And I applaud them to recognize they have problems. And miraculously, as I told you earlier, even though the Jeep was searched for hours and hours, processed for hours and hours, he finds additional evidence. 2 projectiles that everyone else missed, and a blood stain that is important. And that when he did his analysis, 2 important things occurred. He didn't go in there blindly to do any analysis. He told you that the prosecutors in this case told them that the defendant in this case was this young man. And we need you to do a trajectory analysis to put him on the scene. Now, I suggest to you, you could have a Jolly Green Giant and a midget. And if you give them the dimensions, the height and his arm length, with this mathematical formula, you could say the Jolly Green Giant or the midget was a shooter in this case. They would either be closer to the car or further from the car, depending upon their size. If you want to do an analysis, if you want to do an investigation, if you want to figure out who the shooter is, why do you point to this kid and tell him, this is what we want? Why do you do that? This is the great investigation. This is what they want you to do in order to render a verdict that could take him.
Mr. Judge. Over. Proceed.
And tell him that he's going to live life in the state penitentiary without parole or being on death row. This is the investigation they want you to rely upon and say it's proof beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt? I guess so, according to them. And they call Danny Benitez. Who the heck is he? He was on the stand for all of about 2 minutes. Danny Benitez gave Detective Moretti the surveillance tape from the Montessori school. You watched it. It showed, I suggest, nothing probative to implicate this young man in it. But we learned, not from him, but from Moretti, that he doesn't go to the drugstore on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Applebee's to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Polo Tropical or the gas station or the bank on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tapes. When the car's on 184th Avenue, he doesn't go to the fire station to check their tapes, surveillance tapes. Doesn't go back to the 2 elementary schools, Sunset Lakes and West Broward Elementary, to check their surveillance tape, because he knows it all. He knows it. How do you know it if you don't check? How do you know something unless you investigate? We don't have to do a thing, folks. We don't have to do anything except show up. And begrudgingly, we did. Where the Montessori school was, on Pines, there was a tractor supply company and another school. Why don't you get that? And come in here and say, you know what, folks? We checked all of this. Instead, what they do is take a helicopter ride 4 or 5 years later. And we have to sit here and watch as they fly the route. And we have to watch how they drive the route. Not checking what the traffic conditions were that day, back 4 or 5 years ago. Not checking what the weather was 5 years ago in October 26th. What's the purpose of that? Just to add more of what I suggest is a smokescreen. You look at all this and say, heck, man, 100 exhibits, 500 photographs out of a cell phone, all these text messages. What does it mean? Hopefully, for the state, you'll say, hey, where there's smoke, there must be fire. And say, hey, too bad, young man. Too bad. There's a lot of stuff sitting here. And hopefully you will not fall into that trap. And then we get to the lead detective. Well, before we get to the lead detective, I think I missed someone. Trevion Glass, the individual who got into the red Mitsubishi. The man who is convicted of 2 felonies. Now, why is that important? Because the judge read you an instruction on some of the factors to look at in determining whether or not to believe a witness or not. And he told you that one of the factors to look at is whether or not the witness has been convicted of a crime. Trevion Glass, the state calls, as their star witness, basically, to say Melly never got into that red Mitsubishi. And he told you one interesting thing. He said he's got a case pending right now, and he doesn't want to go back to jail. Now, who has the authority to put him in jail? We don't. There's only one person who can put him back in jail. And that's the state of Florida, whether it be through the state attorney's office or the police department. And he miraculously is the only witness that says no one got into the red Mitsubishi from the recording studio. But he tells you, doesn't tell you how he gets into Melly's house. Because he doesn't have a key. So, what's going on here? What's the story here? And then they call the star witness, the lead detective, Detective Moretti. We know he doesn't look at the surveillance tapes on the various Miramar Parkway and Pines and what have you, because he knows. He's worked the area. He knows that he got 9807, the phone that Melly has used, and you've seen various and a lot of photographs. I think it's Exhibit 115, am I correct? 100, excuse me, 100. And who did they get this phone from? Detective Moretti? Jameson Francois. And certainly you asked him, how long have you had this phone? And he says, I never asked him. How convenient. And he goes and says there was another phone in the vehicle, but it was broken. That's 115? 115. So I can't tell you whose phone that is. Now, we don't have the burden to do anything. If you recall, we asked him to take out the SIM card of this broken phone. And there was a reason for it, to tell you the quality of the investigation. He took out that SIM card, read the serial number from that SIM card, which he had never done until you saw him open this phone in the courtroom. And he agreed that you can take that serial number to T-Mobile, Sprint, and what have you, and determine whose phone is, who is the owner, subscriber, and get a warrant for that phone. You've got warrants on a lot of phones. Get a warrant on this phone if you want to see what it is. Moretti doesn't want to do that because he's afraid it'll ruin the investigation. That's why I put these two phones separate and apart from all this other stuff. Now, the state said to you, there was no reason, I think was the exact quote, for the Jeep to stop on the side of the road. I suggest to you that as we have done periodically through this case, the reason was...
Objection, that's not evidence.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Argum. Proceed, counsel.
The reason was because he needed a bathroom break, just like you and I did when I raised my hand or stand up. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, if he needed a bathroom break, in a dark highway, and you saw him carry it in his hand, he'd leave it on the seat of the car. And we know that the car sped off because there was another car waiting, the red Mitsubishi. You want to know there's no reason? The poor kid had to urinate. And the phone was in the car. But they don't want you to know any of this. That's why we had to call Adrian Davis. But let's stay on Moretti for a little while. Because they execute a search warrant on his house, his apartment, and his storage unit. They find ammunition in there. They find in the storage unit, I think, 3 holsters and gun locks. We don't know what type of guns belong to those holsters. We don't know what type of guns were the gun locks to. All we know is there are 3 guns missing based upon the 3 holsters. And Moretti doesn't even ask where these weapons are. What are these weapons? Should it concern you? Yes. Should it show you a lack of evidence? Yes. Ask yourself. They keep telling you to use your common sense. Use your common sense, please. Ask yourself why a lead detective of a double homicide would not ask Jameson Francois, where the hell are the guns? Where the hell are the locks that belong to the guns? Where are they? I suggest to you when you use your common sense, you're going to say, he doesn't want to know. Because God forbid those or one of those could be the murder weapon. And then the investigation of this rap star is down the tubes. He reads to you various messages from various people. But he never goes to talk to these people to see what they meant. You search Jameson Francois' car that supposedly is involved in taking Melly. And 4 months later, well, if you go and search his car, Jameson Francois, let's go back again to his house. Get up here, State, and tell him why you didn't search the house. You learn about Frito Bang, supposedly takes him somewhere. Why in the heck don't you search his house? Even if it's 4 months later, 5 months later, 10 months later, and use that fancy spray. Not the one that causes you to get sick, but the new spray. And look for it. What kind of investigation is this when we're talking about putting a young kid on death row or life without parole? Or any investigation? This is no game, folks. We're playing for all the marbles. That's why they said that Miramar Police Department lacks the training. They did absolutely nothing once they got that surveillance tape. Blinders on them. We're not going to look to the left. We're not going to look to the right. We're just going to direct everything to this young man. And I'm glad they admitted the suspects of 13. We know that Cortland Henry's involved. You heard about Crucial Almighty David Hedgepath, who wrote and texted, "We killed 2 of you." And someone said I should use the word ninjas instead of the word that he used. And in that message, he had a target over someone's face. Whose was it? Guess what? It's Melly. And he did it within hours. And what do? Nothing. Years later, they get his so-called timesheet where he was working. They don't bother to talk to any of his co-employees to verify this. In fact, if you look at the timesheets, it gives him time to, I think he's up in Verrill and Melbourne, to be exactly in Broward County, which is about 2 to 3 hours before the job. It's no alibi at all. But why don't you talk to these people? Why don't you investigate? How in the hell does he send out a text? We killed 2 of you. We were aiming at the Jeep. Bentley, who had a problem with Melly. He does nothing. That's not a person of interest. He knows that there is a incident at Walmart where he's robbed of a chain, I think it is. Why don't you get the surveillance tape? Or at least try so you can say, I tried, and it doesn't exist anymore. Jameson Francois with the missing guns. He's the manager who had, I think, $16 million in his account. If anyone had a motive in this case, it would be Jameson Francois, possibly. I don't know. We don't have to prove a darn thing. Why don't you at least investigate? Why don't you do the work that is required before you ask 12 of you to either put him on death row or life in prison? Jay Green, who had a beef with Melly. Why don't you check him out? Quando Wando, why don't you check him out? Gina, who said he's going to be on a plate. They're going to kill him. Moretti says, I don't even know who the heck Gino is because no one told me. Herc says you got to communicate with us or you're going to pay the consequences. He doesn't know who Herc is. Goon. Same thing. And then the state rests. They say, folks, we've presented you all the evidence. Well, that wasn't true. Because we had to call Adrian Davis. And you learned that Adrian Davis showed up in the state attorney's office and gave a sworn statement. They never told you this. We did. We don't have to do any of this. And Adrian Davis said, I told you. He got in the car. How do I know that? Because I was woken up when someone was crawling in the back seat. How do I know that? When we got to Melly's house, he's the one who had to open the door. Because only he and Cortland Henry had the key to his house. Why do we have to do that? Why did they conceal that from you? Why did they hide that from you? I can't answer those questions, folks, but I don't have to. Other than to say, reasonable doubt. You know, when we started this journey together, the state promised you that they were going to prove their case beyond to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. They told you that they have accepted the responsibility, that they have the burden of proof. They told you that they would prove each element of this case. What they have proved to you is that Cortland Henry is involved in this case. Who else, if anyone else, you folks don't know.